Welcome to Heartbreak Revealed. Discover real stories of wives' betrayals and shocking twists. Hit subscribe button and let's get to our story. The worst thing a woman can do to the man she claims to love is betray that love by cheating on him. Jake Harris thought about that as he sat alone in the dark. Just a few hours ago, he thought he had it all: a solid job at a reputable company that paid well, a nice house, and a wife he thought loved him. He still had the first two, but the third was another matter. He thought about his life with Emma, his wife of nearly 6 years. He met her shortly after she joined the company where he works, Weston Financial Services, a company that helps small businesses with their finances. Like many others, she started in the administrative support section, handling all the clerical tasks that come with their business dealings. From there, she became an executive assistant to Tony Weston, his boss, about 3 months ago. Tony's last name is no coincidence. His grandfather started the company decades ago and handed it off to his son Michael, the current CEO. Michael brought his son Tony into the business after he finished college a couple of years ago and started him off like everyone else to learn the ropes. He did, and was quickly promoted to his current position as the regional manager, reporting only to Michael and the board of directors. Tony was destined to become CEO eventually, but that was years off. Jake liked and respected Michael. Michael was a father figure to him and helped him transition back into civilian life after being wounded in Iraq. They met while Jake was undergoing physical therapy. Michael had just finished a meeting with the board of the facility and stopped to watch the veteran as he worked out. Michael saw something in Jake and bought him lunch that day. They discussed many things during that lunch, and Michael was surprised to learn that Jake had finished his 4-year business degree just days before being shipped off to Iraq. Michael was impressed with the young man and offered him a job on the spot. Surprised, Jake accepted the offer and started working for Michael the next Monday. That was almost 8 years ago. Jake finished his therapy and focused on his work, taking night classes to get his MBA. Then Emma came along. He was smitten with her the day they met. After verifying there would be no repercussions from HR, he asked her on a date. They dated for a few months, fell in love, and eventually married. Michael surprised Jake by paying for their honeymoon to Hawaii. 3 years after they married, Michael brought Tony on board. Jake had hoped something of the old man had rubbed off on Tony, but he learned early on that wasn't the case. Tony liked to drop hints, letting others around him know who his father was, and that one day he would be the one in the big corner office on the top floor. Tony managed to alienate pretty much everyone around him. One day, Michael spoke to Jake about his son and expressed the same concern Jake had heard from others. "You know I'm going to have to make him the regional manager at some point, Jake," Michael said. "I know. I'm counting on you to lead by example. Maybe you can help Tony transition into the job a bit," Michael said. "Think you can do that?" "I think so, Michael. It won't be easy, though." "What's your honest appraisal of him, Jake?" Michael asked. "Don't sugarcoat it. Forget he's my son. Tell it to me straight." "Okay, I will," Jake said. "He's too full of himself to be effective, in my opinion. He refuses to listen to others, spends far too much time flirting with the girls, and likes to throw his name around. Emma tells me he's pretty much a sexual harassment lawsuit waiting to happen. He not only likes to chase the women, but he also likes to brag about it as well." Michael shook his head. "I was afraid of that. His mother doted on him from the time he was born, let him get away with darn near everything. I had hoped bringing him on board might help him mature a bit. I'll have a talk with him." "So, when is Bill going to retire?" Jake asked. Bill Collins, the current regional manager, had been with the company for years, and everyone liked him. He had been talking about retirement for a while, and bought a place up in Montana so he and his wife could retire in the country while he was still young enough to enjoy himself. Sometime in the next 5 months or so, he's dead set on it. Personally, I don't blame him. Michael left the office with a promise to stay in touch. Jake knew he would make good on that promise. There were other things Jake saw in Tony that he didn't tell the old man. Thinking back on it, he realized he probably should have. Bill retired a few months after that discussion, and Michael moved Tony into his position. It didn't take long for Tony to make changes. Some of them were good, but Jake wasn't so certain about others. He continued to do his job, though, and tried not to let Tony trouble him too much. Tony did change as he grew into the position, but Jake didn't like what he saw. Tony tended to micromanage things, oftentimes to the irritation of the more experienced members of the team. He also liked to move people around a lot, sometimes into positions that pretty much set them up for failure. One day, a little more than 6 months ago, Tony came into Jake's office. He popped himself into the chair across from Jake as he was on the phone with a client. When Jake hung up, he looked up to see Tony smirking at him. "What can I do for you, Tony?" Jake asked. "I've been thinking about hiring a new EA," he said, "and I think Emma would fit that role quite nicely." "My wife? That Emma?" Tony nodded his head, the smirk never leaving his face. "One and the same," he said. "What's wrong with Gretchen?" Gretchen Wilson had served for years as Bill's EA. "Nothing. It's just that she's looking to retire in a bit, and the office could use some new blood." "Uh-huh," Jake thought to himself. More like new candy for Tony. "Have you talked to Emma about it?" Jake asked. "Not yet," he said. "I wanted to get with you first." "Oh, I appreciate that, but why? I wanted to know what she's like. After all, you live with her. You sleep with her every night. I mean, is she witchy and demanding, or is she always the happy, bubbly type? Is she playful or serious? I want to know what I'm in for if I bring her in." Jake didn't like the way this discussion was going at all. "Well, Tony," Jake said, "first of all, Emma and I are very happily married. And yes, she's always a joy to be around. Second of all, she's married to me. Third, she's a professional. If you think she's qualified for the job, then offer it to her. Whether she accepts or not is up to her. But the most important thing to remember is this: she's married to me." Jake deliberately repeated himself to make sure Tony understood his position. "I get it. You've probably heard the gossip, and you're concerned. I would be too if I was married to someone as beautiful as Emma. If she takes the job, it would mean travel, sometimes overnight. Are you okay with that? I trust my wife. If she accepts the job, knowing that's part of it, then she knows the boundaries. And I expect you to respect those boundaries in my marriage." "Of course, Jake, old buddy," Tony said, the smirk never leaving his face. "I know you and my old man are tight. He respects you, and so do I. Believe me, I'd never do anything to get between you and Emma. I hope not." "Who knows," Tony said. "There might even be a promotion in it for you as well." That night, Jake spoke with Emma. "Did you speak with Tony today?" he asked as she put the finishing touches on their dinner. "Yeah," she said. "He mentioned something about wanting me to be his new EA. And what do you think about that?" Jake asked. "Well, it would mean some travel and probably some late hours. But it would also mean a nice raise. We could certainly use the extra money, especially if we're going to have children someday." "Why? Are you concerned about something? I just remember you telling me that he was a sexual harassment lawsuit waiting to happen. Do you still feel the same way?" "I'd be lying to you if I said I wasn't concerned," she said. "I do hear all the rumors, you know. Do you trust me?" He looked at her before answering. "Of course I trust you," he said, "but I trust him about as far as I can throw him. He came by my office today and asked how you were at home. I thought it was a bit impertinent personally. That's just the way he is." "What did you tell him?" she asked, her eyebrows raised. "I told him you're a joy to be around, and I meant it. I also let it be known that you and I are happily married, and I would expect him to respect that. I would expect nothing less myself," she said. "Good. So, are you going to take the job?" "I think so," she responded. "We went to bed that night and made love before falling asleep. She took the job and, as predicted, was gone at least once every 2 weeks for up to 2 days at a time. She also ended up working late at least 3 nights a week. Jake dealt with it as best he could and did all he could to support Emma in her new role. He kept an eye out but saw nothing that suggested she was anything but professional in her new job. Then, the unthinkable happened. A little more than 3 months ago, Michael suffered a massive stroke one day in his office. Paramedics were called, and he was rushed to the hospital, but he didn't last the night. He passed away, having never regained consciousness. Everyone in the company was devastated by the news and attended his funeral. Jake and Emma were surprised at how many people were there. Tony thought his father's untimely death meant he would immediately move into Michael's office and take over as CEO, but the board of directors thought otherwise, saying Tony was far too inexperienced for that role. Over Tony's vehement objections, the board brought on Mark Davis to serve as an interim CEO until a suitable replacement could be named. Tony became a changed man after that and set out to prove he was ready for the helm. He had Emma working almost every night until late and made her accompany him nearly every weekend on trips out of town. It didn't matter if Jake and Emma had plans or not. The schedule was taking its toll on both of them, and their marriage suffered as a result. For starters, their sex life almost disappeared completely. He also noticed changes in Emma's wardrobe. Where she had normally worn business and professional attire, she was now wearing clothes that were a bit more revealing. On top of that, her attitude toward him had changed somewhat. She had always been outgoing, friendly, bubbly, and respectful, but now she was a bit more demanding, short-tempered, and had started tossing little digs at him. He thought that perhaps it was simply from the stress of her job. Finally, one Sunday when Emma returned from a weekend trip to Miami, he sat her down for a talk. "Emma, we need to talk." "About what?" she said with an edge in her voice. "About us. I rarely ever see you anymore. This schedule Tony has you on is not just killing you, it's killing us. We need to take some time off and reconnect." "I'm sorry, Jake. Tony has a lot going on right now. Things are crazy. I can't help it. Tell Tony you're taking a week's vacation. You have the time. We need to do this if we're going to survive." Emma said nothing for a few moments as she collected her thoughts. He could tell this was bothering her as well. Finally, she nodded her head. "You're right, Jake. I could use a break. Tony's been running me ragged these last few months. I'll talk to him tomorrow, I promise. Please do." The next day, Emma came home happier than he had seen her in a long time. "What happened?" Jake asked. "I talked to Tony like I told you, and he agreed we need to take a breather. He said we could both take next week off if we want, so long as we attend a party at his place Friday night." "Party?" Jake asked. "What kind of party? It's just a little get-together with him and some of his friends." Jake didn't feel comfortable with this. Partly, he really didn't care for the little twerp, but also because he didn't feel it appropriate to be partying with his boss. As the saying goes, familiarity breeds contempt. Plus, he didn't know who else would be at this get-together. "Do you know any of these people?" "I've met some of them," she said. "They're mostly friends of his from college, but one or two of them work for clients. I don't know who else is coming, though." "I see," Jake said. "Well, all right. But only if you can get home at a normal hour this week. Can you do that?" "I think so. We do have to work on the Weston account on Wednesday, though. Tony is having a dinner meeting with him, and he wants me to be there." He was aware of the Weston manufacturing account. It had become something of a priority since it was something Michael started handling before his stroke. "Okay, Wednesday night. But the rest of the week, I want you home at a normal hour. Deal?" She smiled and wrapped her arms around him. "Deal," she whispered, kissing him on the lips. The next afternoon, Tony showed up at Jake's office and, as usual, sat down in the chair in front of the desk across from Jake. As usual, he had that never-ending smirk on his face. "What can I do for you, Tony?" Jake asked. "Emma tells me you guys are on for Friday night." "Emma?" Jake wondered. Where did that come from? He called her that once, and she let him know in no uncertain terms that she hated that name. "Yes, we discussed it briefly last night, provided she gets home at a decent hour the rest of the week, and we get next week off to reconnect. Of course, we do have that dinner meeting with the folks from Weston on Wednesday, but I promise, no late nights the rest of the week." "What kind of a party is this?" Jake asked. "And who all is going to be there?" "It's just a casual get-together. A few of my old college buddies will be there. One of them works for a client, but it's nothing fancy. Come casual. You don't need to bring anything except Emma, of course." Jake took that in and nodded his head. Tony wasn't finished. "By the way, Jake, old buddy," Tony said, causing Jake to wince inside, "you were right. Emma is a joy to be with. I appreciate you letting her take the time she needs to do her job without giving her a lot of crap. She's quite good at what she does. Frankly, I'd be lost without her." Jake didn't quite know how to take that. "I'm glad you're satisfied with her work, Tony," he said. "One thing, though." "What's that?" Tony asked. "Do you call her Emma to her face?" "Of course, why? Just curious, that's all." That night, he mentioned it to Emma while they were eating. "Do you always let Tony call you Emma?" he asked. "I'm just curious because you never let me call you that." "I figure he's my boss, and he can call me whatever he wants," Emma said. Jake dropped it, but it still bothered him. The rest of the week went pretty well, and except for Wednesday night, she was home right on time. and they made love every chance they got. That Friday, after Jake threw on a pair of jeans and a casual shirt, he watched Emma get ready for the party and noticed the dress she chose to wear. He had never seen this dress before and wondered when she got it. It was much shorter than her other dresses and seemed to show off a lot of skin. He also noticed the thong she put on. He had never seen this thong before. Then she threw on the dress, not bothering to wear a bra. This was definitely something different. After she had the dress on, he took it all in. It was shorter on one side than the other and had slits up the sides from her waist to her arms. He could see why she chose not to wear a bra. The front exposed a lot of flesh, and the back was open to a point right above her butt, almost revealing her thong. He could see her breasts swell against the material. "Wow, you look good enough to eat. Maybe we should stay home and play." She smiled. No, after we get home." "By the way, where did you get that dress?" Jake asked. "I've never seen it before. It sure doesn't look casual to me. I got it the last time we were in Miami. Tony asked me to wear it tonight." Of course, he thought. Better be careful. Someone might get the wrong idea. She chuckled at that. "I don't think so," she said. "Everyone knows their boundaries." "They better," he said, giving his wife a hug. He started to kiss her, but she waved him off. "Later. I don't want my makeup messed up." They drove to Tony's two-story townhouse located in a fairly ritzy part of town and rang the doorbell. Tony opened the door and invited them inside. Jake detected the faint odor of marijuana and had a sinking feeling. 3 other young men about Tony's age came into the front room, and Tony introduced them to Jake. "Guys, this is the man of the hour, Jake Harris," Tony said with a big grin on his face. "Jake, this is Paul Green, Steve Adams, and Eric Carter. Eric, by the way, works for Weston." Jake shook hands with all 3 of the men and wondered what Tony meant by calling him the man of the hour. He also wondered why Tony didn't introduce Emma to them. Did she already know them? Tony turned his attention to Emma. "My God, Emma, you look so hot in that dress. I knew you would. Doesn't she look hot, guys?" he asked, turning to the other 3 men. They all nodded their heads, their tongues nearly dragging on the floor. Emma smiled and turned around as if modeling the dress for them. They whistled their appreciation. Jake had to admit she did look good, but he didn't care too much for Tony's reaction. "Where are my manners?" Tony asked. "Here, let me get you 2 something to drink. Emma, I know you like white wine. What about you, Jake?" "That's fine for me as well. I really don't drink much these days. Very low tolerance to alcohol." Jake really didn't have a low tolerance to alcohol. The truth was that he could probably drink these bozos under the table. He all but quit drinking years ago while he was in the Marines. In reality, he was a mean drunk and nearly killed a much bigger man with his bare hands the last time he got drunk. After that, he swore it would never happen again. "No problem. I'll be right back." Tony came back with 2 glasses and handed them to Jake and Emma. Emma took a big swig from hers while Jake took very small sips. Jake's internal red flag was waving, and he swore to remain as sober as possible. Something about all this didn't sit right with him. Tony invited everyone to take a seat in his living room. Jake followed Emma and noticed that she sat on a love seat. He started to sit next to her, but Tony beat him to the punch. Instead, he took a seat on a couch that faced the love seat and watched his wife carefully. Tony looked at him for a moment. "Sorry, old buddy, force of habit. I'm used to sitting on this side of the love seat." "No problem," Jake said, looking at his wife. She looked back but couldn't read his face. They sat for a while, engaging in small talk. Tony looked at Jake before he spoke up. "My dad told me you were in the Marines. Is that right?" Jake nodded his head. "Yeah, I served 5 years before I got a medical discharge," he said. Paul looked at Jake. "Marines, huh?" he asked. "I hear they're real bad asses. You ever see any combat? Ever kill anyone?" Jake slowly nodded his head. He hated it when people asked that. "Yeah," he said quietly. "What, see combat or kill anyone?" Paul asked. "Both," Jake said. Emma looked at him, surprised. He never told her any of this before. He spent the last several years trying to forget about all that. "You never told me that," she said. "It's not something I like to talk about." Steve pulled out a large plastic bag. Jake recognized it as marijuana. It was legal to purchase in this state, but he never cared for it much, having tried it once while in high school. "Hey," Steve said, "I scored some really good stuff. You guys want to try some?" "Yeah, sure," Tony said. The others, including Emma, agreed. Jake had never known her to smoke anything, especially marijuana. Steve rolled a large joint and lit it up. He passed it around, and the others took a hit off of it. Jake held up his hand and shook his head when Steve offered it to him. "Thanks, but no. I never really cared for it." Steve nodded his head and passed it to Tony. Tony took a hit and looked at Jake. "Ah, come on, Jake. Lighten up a bit." "You go ahead," Jake said. "I'd like to keep a clear head tonight." "You're lost, man. Besides, this is a party. If you get too screwed up, you can always stay here. Hell, you're going to be off next week anyway." He turned to Emma. "Shotgun?" he asked. Jake was surprised when she smiled and eagerly nodded her head. "Sure," she said. Tony put the lit end of the joint in his mouth, and Emma opened her mouth as he blew a huge amount of smoke into her. She inhaled it all, coughing just a bit. She patted her chest as she inhaled. "That is some good stuff," she said. Jake was stunned and wondered who this woman was. Tony handed the joint back to Steve. "You know," Tony said, pointing a finger at Jake, "this man is without question the best business analyst in the company. Hell, he saved us millions of dollars in lost revenue. Not only that, but if it weren't for him, I wouldn't have this lovely creature as my assistant." Emma smiled at him, and Jake noticed it wasn't just the kind of smile one gives in response to a compliment. There was something else. He also noticed the way she seemed to hang on his every utterance. "In fact," Tony said, looking at Jake, "I like to think of her as my work wife." He patted Emma's bare thigh, and Jake thought he saw Tony's hand start to inch under her short dress. Jake saw Emma's face flush for just a moment before Tony pulled his hand back. "Truth is, I'd be lost without her," Tony added. "So would I," Jake said, watching Tony's reaction. He couldn't help but notice that Emma looked down at the floor for just a moment. "If you'll excuse me for just a bit, I need to use the restroom," Jake added, breaking the silence in the room. "Sure," Tony said. "Just go down the hall, first door on the left." Jake got up and walked into the bathroom, locking the door behind him. He looked in the mirror for a moment, a million thoughts running through his head. Prime among them was the idea that Emma was cheating on him with Tony. Tony was right about one thing: Jake was a damn good analyst, but that was because he paid attention to detail. It was something Michael taught him when he first started. "Remember, son, it's not just numbers. In any business deal, the devil's always hiding in the details," the old man told him. "Pay attention to the details, trust your gut, and you'll never go wrong." Jake took the old man's words to heart, and they always served him well. Now he had other details to think about. First, there was Emma's dress, or lack thereof. Second, there was the interaction between her and Tony. Third, her drug use. He had never known her to use drugs, and they had never even experimented with them before. But here she was, eagerly accepting what Tony gave her. Then there was her reaction to Tony's touch and Tony's own words. What was it he called her? His work wife? What the hell was that all about? Then there were all the little things he had noticed over the last 3 months. Added together, it all spelled trouble. And if he was right, it also meant the end of his marriage. He sensed that something was going to happen and knew he had to get out of there with something tangible he could use as proof. He considered simply taking Emma and leaving, but he had a feeling it would only cause a fight and delay the inevitable. He saw his cell phone in his shirt pocket and noticed the camera lens peeking out over the top of the pocket. "That's it," he thought. He pulled the phone out and started a video recording before placing it back in his pocket. After he did his business, he flushed the toilet and washed his hands. He steeled himself before he opened the door. As he walked into the front room, he noticed Emma suddenly sit up after leaning over the coffee table. He saw a few specks of white powder on her nose and realized she had probably sniffed a line of cocaine. Tony also had a bit of white powder on his nose, as did the other 3 men. He sat down and saw the guilty look on her face. He picked up his glass and took a small sip when he spotted undissolved granules of some kind of powder in the bottom of his glass. What the hell? He quickly set the glass back down on the table and noticed everyone looking at him. He started to say something, but suddenly found himself very tired and unable to say anything coherent. "Are you okay?" he heard Emma ask. He looked at her, confused, unable to speak. Tony and the 3 men stood up. Emma stood up with them and grabbed Tony's arm. He looked at them all, wondering what they were going to do next. He tried to stand but was unable to. "Why don't you just take a little nap for a while, Jake, old buddy?" Tony asked as the other men put his feet up on the couch. Jake was unable to do or say anything as Emma removed his shoes. He wanted to get up, grab her, and run out as fast as he could. He looked around, trying to find anything he could to support himself, and saw her thong on the love seat where she and Tony were sitting. The witch, he thought. Emma came over to him and covered him with an Afghan. He wanted to grab her by the throat but couldn't move his arms. She leaned down and kissed him on the forehead. "I'm sorry, Jake," she whispered in his ear. "I really do love you." Unable to keep his eyes open, he fell into a deep sleep. The whole place was dark when he awoke. He rubbed the sleep out of his eyes and looked around. It seemed no one was awake. He listened and heard nothing but the sound of snoring coming from upstairs. Glancing at his phone, he realized he had been out for a little more than 3 hours. He stopped the video recording and put the phone back in his pocket. He crept upstairs and glanced into the master suite, making sure he stayed in the shadows. He saw Emma nude on Tony's bed, her arm over his chest and one leg over his. One of the 3 men was also naked and laying next to Emma on the large bed. The other 2 men were also asleep, one on a couch under the window and the other positioned precariously in an overstuffed recliner sitting in one corner. He crept quietly back downstairs. He wanted to find out what it was they had dosed him with, so he rummaged around in Tony's kitchen until he found a Tupperware container with a screw-on lid. He poured the drink in the container and sealed it up tight. Going back to the front room, he pulled Emma's keychain from her purse and noticed a key he never saw before. It looked like a house key, but it wasn't one of theirs. Acting on a hunch, he pulled the key off and stuffed it in his pocket. Then he had another thought and grabbed Emma's phone, putting it in his pants pocket. He planned on going through it later on. Pulling his wedding ring off, he set it carefully on the top of her purse so she would easily see it. He put his shoes back on and crept to the door. Details, he thought to himself. He looked around but didn't see a security system or a console anywhere near the door. Opening the front door, he tried the key he took off Emma's ring. It fit perfectly, just as he thought it might. He quietly closed the door behind him, locking it with her key. He got in his car, closing the door as quietly as he could. He backed out of the driveway and left, not turning his lights on until he was on the street. He had an idea and pulled into a convenience store. He pulled out his phone and looked up his old friend Rick Thompson. In the service, Jake knew him as Corporal Thompson, but all his friends simply called him Rick. After he left the service, he started his own private investigative firm, and Jake helped him with the financial details. "Hello," a sleepy Rick said when he answered the phone. "Hey, Rick. It's me, Jake. Sorry to call so late, but I need your help." "What's up, Jake? You get in a bar fight and need me to bail you out or something?" "Not quite. Can you be at my place in about 15 or 20 minutes?" "Yeah, sure," Rick said. "Everything all right? What's going on? I'd rather not talk about it over the phone." "Gotcha," Rick said. "I'll see you in about 20 minutes. "Thanks, buddy. I appreciate it." "Hey, Semper Fi, do or die, right?" Jake chuckled. Rick liked to say that a lot. "Oorah," Jake said. They ended the call, and Jake looked at the store. Screw it, he thought to himself. He bought a 12-pack of beer and a couple of packs of cigarettes. He hadn't smoked since he left the service, but at this point, he felt he needed to do something before he punched something or someone out. He got home and put the beer in his refrigerator, grabbing one for himself. He opened a pack of cigarettes and lit one up after he sat on the couch, using a candy dish that had their picture on the inside for an ashtray. It was a wedding gift to them, and Emma liked to keep it stocked with little candies and treats. He didn't care if Emma complained about the smell, especially after what happened earlier. About that time, he heard the doorbell and saw it was Rick. He invited his old friend inside and offered him a beer. "What's up, man?" Rick asked as he opened his beer. Jake filled him in on what happened earlier in the evening. "Holy shit," Rick said when Jake finished. Jake handed him the container that held the dosed wine. "Think you can get that analyzed?" he asked. Rick nodded his head. "Yeah, but it'll probably be Monday or Tuesday before I can get results." Jake said, "I also need everything you can get me on Tony Weston, Paul Green, Steve Adams, and Eric Carter." Jake said, I understand Carter works for Weston Manufacturing. I don't know what he does there. He pulled out his phone and brought up the video from earlier. He scanned through it until he found a frame that showed all four of them. Here's a picture of them. I know it's not the best. Got it, Rick said. You want surveillance from inside his place as well as yours? Yeah, if you can swing it, Jake said. I've got a key if you want it. I didn't see any security system, but that doesn't mean anything. Rick took the key and looked at it. No problem, he said. How did you get this, by the way? I took it off Emma's keychain, Jake told him. Rick nodded his head. You realize you probably won't be able to use any video from inside his place as evidence, right? Right, Jake asked. I figured as much, Jake said. This is personal. I really don't give a damn about what's legal or not right now. I understand, Rick said. Jake handed Rick an extra key to his house. Here's a key for this place, Jake said. He wrote down a 4-digit number and handed it to him. And this is the code for my security system. I don't think I'll need the key. If you want, I can set up some equipment while I'm here, Rick said, handing the key back. High-def cameras, audio, the works. Hell, I can even record what gets said on your landline. Do it, Jake said. How much is all this going to cost me? Don't worry about it, Rick said. You saved my skin over there in Iraq. This is the least I can do for you. Thanks, old friend, Jake said. At least let me cover your costs. All right, if you insist, Rick said. What else have you got? You showed me part of the video you took. Why don't we go through some of it and see if we can get some clues? Jake pulled the video back up and started it from the beginning. Stop right there, Rick said. Jake paused the video. Can you back it up just a bit? Jake did as Rick asked, and they watched again. The camera clearly picked up Emma finishing a line of white powder that was laid out on the coffee table. Jake stopped the video. Damn, he said. I saw her just as she sat back up, but that clearly looks like coke on the table. Yes, it does, Rick said. Interesting. Have you ever known Emma to use before? Jake shook his head. No, never. Okay, let's see what else is on here. Jake started the video again, and they could tell when Jake sat on the couch across from Emma. Hold up, Rick said. What's that? He asked, pointing to something on the love seat. Jake looked closely and saw it was Emma's thong. Holy shit, he said. I saw that right before I passed out, but I thought I was just seeing things. I'll bet she took it off right after I got up to use the bathroom. He started the video back up, and they could tell when the drug had started to affect Jake. They saw the camera pointing up as he laid down and watched as the four others looked down at him. They heard Emma ask if he was okay and Tony telling him to take a nap. Then they saw Emma lean over him and whisper in his ear. Jake remembered this, but he had no recollection of what they heard next. You sure you don't want to tie him up and make him watch us? Steve asked. No, Emma said. This is enough for one night. We have all week, you know. We can always step things up if he doesn't go along with the program, Tony said. You know, Paul swings both ways. Maybe he could introduce old Jake to the joy of the other side, he added to laughter. Jake felt his face turn red as he heard Emma join them. Now that's something I'd like to see, she said. Really? They heard Paul ask. You'd let me screw your husband in the ass? Sure, why not, she said. Maybe if you're nice, you can get him to do more. They all laughed again. Wow, I've never done a Marine before, Paul said. I doubt he can give as good a fuck as you, though. Jake fought back the urge to throw his phone through the wall. Seriously, Tony, is he going to be okay? You didn't give him too much, did you? Emma asked. Nah, hell be fine, Tony said. Hell sleep for about 12 hours. Wake up with a bit of a headache. Hell think he just drank too much. Tomorrow I'll introduce him to the really hard stuff. By this time next week, old Jake here will be a full-fledged coke-loving addict. Maybe I'll even have him work the street for me. Too bad dear old dad isn't around to see his golden boy fall. Is that why you hate him so much? They heard Emma ask. That's all I heard about while I was in college, Tony said. About how good old Jake went to school while serving his country and fighting for America. About how he worked to make something of himself while defending his country. Sometimes I thought Dad would rather have Jake as a son than me. Well, guess what, Dad? I'm Jake's boss now. I have Jake's woman, and by this time next week, your golden boy will be a coke-sucking drug addict. They all laughed at that. Are you boys with me on this? He asked. They heard the three of them say yes. What about you, Emma? Are you with me? Because if you're not, tell me now, and I promise you'll be on the street with him. I'm with you, sweetie, Emma said. Besides, I've grown to love this too much to walk away from it. We assumed she was referring to Tony's manhood, as we couldn't see what she was referring to. All right then, Tony said. Come on, let's go upstairs and get the real party started. Goody, Emma said as they headed up the stairs. This time I want you guys to make me airtight. There was no movement in the video, but they could hear the sounds of sex coming from the bedroom. Jake ended the video and put his head in his hands. Rick put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. I know this is going to be rough on you, but we'll get you through this. Jake nodded his head. Thanks, Rick. What are you going to do? I'm divorcing her, there's no question about that. I understand, Rick said. Why don't you get away from here for a few days? Let me and the boys handle this. What do you plan on doing? Jake asked. It's probably best if you don't know, Rick said. I can tell you this. We just witnessed a criminal conspiracy. If I have my way, someone will go to jail, but we need to get you out of here for a bit. But I can help you, Jake said. Rick shook his head. No, you're in danger right now, and the last thing we need is for you to go off on any of them. Remember old Gunnery Sergeant Johnson? Well, he's retired and in Vegas now. He owes me a favor or three. He said he'd set me up with a place to rack out for a few days if I ever wanted to visit Vegas. I'll call him and see what he can do for you. Jake nodded his head. Okay, let me get the place here wired for audio and video, then I'll head out. You need to maintain, understand? Jake nodded his head. Thanks, Rick. You're a good friend, I appreciate it. Rick smiled. Semper Fi, bro, do or die, Rick said. Ura, Jake said. He went on the back porch with a beer as Rick wired the front room and the bedrooms for audio and video. Rick also tapped the house phone. He set it up so that all the audio and video would be stored on a cloud server that could be accessed from anywhere on the internet. When he finished, he gave Jake the server address and credentials to access the files. He also showed Jake the switch that would let him turn the surveillance system on and off. I'll call Gunnery Sergeant Johnson tomorrow and let you know what he says. One way or another, we're getting you out of here. Don't do anything stupid, you hear me? I hear you, Rick, Jake said. I hope so, Jake, he said. Hang tough, my friend. I'll be in touch. I will, Rick, Jake said. Thanks again for everything. After Rick left, Jake turned on his computer and pulled up his bank accounts. He still had one open from before he got married that was in his name only. Since he married Emma, he deposited 10 of his earnings into that as a rainy day fund. He had hoped to use the money for a cruise as a surprise gift to Emma, but those days were done. He transferred half of everything out of their joint account into his old account, then paid off and canceled their joint credit cards. He still had a card in his name only from his original account. Shutting that down, he packed enough clothes to last him a few days and threw the suitcases into his car. Coming inside the house, his gaze fell on the wedding portrait that hung on the wall over the fireplace. Emma looked so beautiful in her wedding dress that day. He was the happiest man on earth and thought he had hit the jackpot. But no longer. Filled with rage at her betrayal, he grabbed a large hunting knife and shredded the portrait. Once finished, he looked around and pulled down every picture that included Emma. All of them got tossed into the fireplace. He ran upstairs and pulled her wedding dress from the closet, then tossed that into the fireplace as well. He considered burning it all right then, but decided to wait a bit. At that moment, he was filled with blind, seething hatred for her and wanted her to personally witness their marriage going up in flames. Then he had another idea. Grabbing a bottle of beer, he went back to the couch and picked up his phone. He emailed the video to himself and verified it on his laptop. He wrote a very carefully worded letter to each member of the board of directors and David, the interim CEO, explaining in detail what had transpired. He remembered something Michael had told him before. The board wouldn't respond too well to threats, but they would respond to a careful and thoughtful analysis of any situation. He didn't know David very well, having only spoken to him a few times, but hoped he was as reasonable as the members of the board. Without threatening anyone, he reminded the board that Tony, as an executive, was required to operate under the morals clause of his employment agreement, and his actions, along with those of his wife, were exactly the kind of things the morals clause was written to address. He also reminded them that their actions were not only criminal in nature, but were the types of things that could spark lawsuits and scandal, the type of scandal that could easily destroy a company like Weston Financial. He reminded them of his time with the company, telling them of his great respect for Michael. He expressed hope they would do the right thing. He read and reread his letter, editing a few words here and there. When he was satisfied, he wrote an email, attaching the letter and the video, and sent it to David as well as each member of the board, telling them he would be on vacation for the week but could be reached by email or phone. He suspected he probably wouldn't hear anything until Tuesday, and by then he planned to be out of the area. He then sat back, lit up a cigarette, and put it in the candy dish, watching as the heat from the lit cigarette burned into Emma's face. At that moment, that's exactly what he wanted to do to her. He picked up her phone and unlocked it. He knew the code since he set it up for her when he first got it. He went through her text messages and got even more furious. It seemed the two of them had been screwing for at least the last 6 months, but it was only in the last 3 that Emma began openly disrespecting him to Tony. Of course, he thought, just the fact that she was screwing him was disrespectful enough. He found a treasure trove of pictures of Tony naked. There were other pictures of Tony and Emma playing kissy face and dancing in a nightclub, perhaps in New York, and pictures of Emma's face surrounded by other naked men. Other pictures showed her getting plowed by 2 men at the same time. One of them showed her getting screwed from the rear by a large man, while Tony did her face. He wondered who took the pictures, and if they were taken with this phone or another device. She had also stored videos on the phone, videos of her having sex with Tony and others, including the 3 men at the party. No wonder she acted as if she already knew them, he thought. So this is what she had been doing while claiming to be on work-related trips. He copied everything he could and emailed it to himself using her device. By then, he had downed 6 beers and smoked half a pack of cigarettes, grinding them out on her face in the bottom of the dish. He looked outside and saw that the sun had already started to rise. Soon, he thought, she would be up and would know that he had left. He figured she would be up in about an hour or 2, so he grabbed his shotgun, made sure it was loaded, and locked both locks on his door. Then he laid back down on the couch with the shotgun next to him and tried to get some sleep. Emma woke up and looked at the clock on the nightstand next to Tony's bed. She saw it was 8:30, so she rolled out of bed and went to the bathroom to clean up. Tony and the others began to stir and were up by the time she got out of the bathroom. Tony threw on a robe and looked at Emma. "You want to go downstairs and get some breakfast started?" he asked. "Jake will probably want some coffee, assuming he's waking up." "Yeah, sure," she said. She tossed on a robe, padded downstairs in her bare feet, and went into the kitchen. She started a pot of coffee and walked into the living room to wake up her husband. Then she realized with a start that he wasn't there. The Afghan she put over him was thrown back, and his shoes were gone. She ran around the first floor, thinking that perhaps he was in the bathroom, but he wasn't there. Looking out the front window, she realized their car was gone. She turned around and saw his ring sitting on her purse, which was lying on its side on the coffee table. "Oh, shit!" she gasped. She ran upstairs yelling. Tony stopped her as she ran into the master bedroom. "What's wrong?" "He's gone," she said. "What do you mean gone?" "Has gone, goddammit," she yelled. "He must have woken up in the middle of the night and left. He took the car and left his wedding ring. You better call him and see if you can track him down. Tell him he needs to come pick you up." "Okay," she said, running back downstairs. She put Jake's ring in her purse and looked for her phone, but it wasn't there. She was certain she had brought it with her last night. She never went anywhere without it. By then, Tony was downstairs. "My phone is gone." "That's okay. Use the house phone. You don't understand. I never go anywhere without it. It's full of texts along with the pictures and videos you sent to me. If he has it, he's probably seen them. Don't worry about it. What we need to do is get him over here. The boys and I will take things over from there. Now call him." Emma nodded her head and picked up the phone in Tony's living room. She nervously dialed Jake's cell phone, hoping he would answer. "Hello?" Jake said when he answered. He sounded as if he had just woken up. "Jake, sweetie, it's me. The hell you want?" he growled. Emma recoiled. He had never spoken to her like that before. She realized he must be super pissed. She had no idea. "Jake, honey, you weren't here when I got up, and I was worried about you. Are you all right? What the hell do you care?" "Sweetheart, I need you to come pick me up at Tony's house. she said. "Could you do that for me? Pretty please?" Jake laughed into the phone, a bitter, angry sound that sent chills down her spine. "Pick you up? You've got to be kidding me. I'm done with you, Emma. I know everything. Your affair, the drugs, all of it. You're a disgusting bitch, and I want nothing to do with you ever again. Jake, please, let's talk about this. I can explain. Explain what? How you hoard yourself out to Tony and his friends? How you laughed about making me a drug addict? There's nothing to explain. We're done." Emma was silent for a moment. Then she heard Tony's voice in the background. "Put it on speaker," Tony said. Emma did as he asked, and Tony took the phone from her. "Listen, Jake, old buddy, let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. Come over here, pick up Emma, and we can talk about this like adults." "Adults? You think I want to be anywhere near you people? I've already contacted a lawyer. I'm filing for divorce, and I'll make sure everyone knows what a scumbag you are, Tony. Your dad would be ashamed of you. You think anyone will believe you?" Tony sneered. "You're nothing. It'll ruin you, Jake. You'll be a laughingstock. Just come over and we can sort this out." "Go to hell," Jake said, hanging up the phone. He took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over him. He knew he had a long road ahead, but he was determined to make sure Emma and Tony paid for their betrayal. Back at Tony's house, Tony slammed the phone down in frustration. Emma looked at him, fear evident in her eyes. "What are we going to do?" she asked. "Don't worry. We'll find him," Tony said. "He can hide forever. Well, get him back here, and then we'll deal with him." Jake knew he couldn't stay at the house any longer. He needed to get out of town and figure out his next move. He packed the rest of his things, grabbed his shotgun, and locked up the house. He got into his car and drove off, heading towards Rick's place. When he arrived, Rick was already waiting for him. "Did you hear from her?" Rick asked. "Yeah, she tried to get me to come back. Tony took the phone and tried to threaten me. I'm done with them, Rick. I need to get away from here and figure out my next steps." "I've got a place you can stay," Rick said. "It's a bit out of the way, but you'll be safe there. Well, get this all sorted out." "Thanks, Rick. I appreciate it. Don't mention it. Let's get you settled in, and then we'll work on getting the evidence we need to nail Tony and Emma." They drove to a small cabin in the woods, far from prying eyes. Rick helped Jake set up, and they spent the next few days gathering all the evidence they could. Jake sent everything he had to his lawyer, making sure the divorce papers were ready to go. He knew it would be a tough battle, but he was ready to fight. A few days later, Rick received a call from Gunnery Sergeant Johnson. He had arranged for Jake to stay with him in Vegas for a while. Jake packed up his things and prepared to leave, feeling a sense of determination he hadn't felt in years. As he drove away from the cabin, he looked back one last time, knowing he was leaving his old life behind. He was ready for a new beginning, one without Emma and Tony. He vowed to make them pay for their betrayal and to never let anyone hurt him like that again. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jake knew one thing for sure: he would come out stronger on the other side, and he would make sure that everyone knew the truth about what happened. He wouldn't rest until justice was served. Thanks for watching. How would you handle discovering your spouse's betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life stories. See you in the next video.